On a cold evening, when the streets had emptied and silence carried the weight of loneliness, a homeless veteran sat on the curb, clutching the few belongings he still had. His life had been marked by sacrifice, years spent in service, battles fought for people he would never meet, and scars both seen and unseen. Yet now, he was forgotten, vulnerable, and alone. As shadows grew, danger approached. A group of attackers, fueled by cruelty rather than need, set their sights on him. For a moment, it seemed as though the man who had once defended his nation would be left defenseless. But fate does not always bow to darkness. Before harm could strike, strangers began to appear. First one, then another, and then many more. Without hesitation, they stepped forward, forming a barrier with their own bodies. Shoulder to shoulder, they created a human wall around the veteran, their presence a silent but powerful declaration. He would not be abandoned again. The attackers froze, their confidence shaken. They had expected weakness, but instead, they were met with unity. These strangers did not know the man's story, nor did they share his past, but they recognized his humanity. Their actions were instinctive, born from a truth we all carry deep within, that no one deserves to stand alone when threatened, least of all someone who once stood for everyone else. The veteran lifted his eyes, disbelief etched across his worn face. For years, he had felt invisible, as though his sacrifices had faded into the background of a world that had moved on. Yet here, in the middle of an ordinary street, he was seen, not as a burden, not as forgotten, but as a man worth protecting. His silence broke into quiet tears, not of fear, but of relief. In that moment, the scene became more than just an act of defense. It was a reminder of the power of compassion. Strangers, bound by nothing but conscience, prove that courage is not reserved for the battlefield. It can rise in everyday people, in ordinary places, and in the moments when humanity chooses to stand together against cruelty. And on that night, the world witnessed the simple truth that dignity is restored when hearts unite as one. The attackers hesitated, their mocking laughter fading into uneasy silence as the wall of strangers grew taller and stronger before them. What had started as a simple attempt to prey on a vulnerable man had now become something entirely different. The crowd was no longer just passers-by. They had transformed into protectors, their bodies forming an unbreakable barrier of flesh and will. The cruelty in the attackers' eyes dimmed, replaced with the realization that they were outnumbered, not in strength, but in humanity. Among the wall of strangers stood a young woman who had been walking home from work. She was not large, nor did she carry the confidence of someone used to confrontation, yet she refused to move. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she stayed rooted to the ground, her body shielding the veteran. Beside her stood an older man with tired eyes, who quietly removed his jacket and placed it over the veteran's shoulders. They had never met before, but in that moment, they became family, united by something unspoken. The veteran, still seated on the cold pavement, watched in silence, his hands trembling. For years, he had fought enemies on battlefields far away, but nothing had left him as defenseless as poverty and invisibility. He had long believed no one would ever stand for him again. Yet here they were, ordinary people who owed him nothing, yet gave him everything he had been denied: dignity, protection, and worth. The attackers shuffled back a few steps, their arrogance cracking as whispers of the growing crowd spread. More people slowed their pace, some recording on their phones, others simply standing alongside the wall, adding to its strength. The line of protection expanded, not because of fear, but because of courage multiplying in the presence of others. The message was clear: no one would touch this man. Not tonight. And within the heavy silence, the veteran felt something he had not felt in years: a flicker of belonging. His tears spilled freely, not from weakness, but from the overwhelming realization that he was not forgotten. For the first time in so long, he felt seen, valued, and defended. The human wall was no longer just a shield. It was a reminder that even in the darkest corners, light can still find a way through strangers' hearts. The leader of the attackers, frustrated and embarrassed, tried to step forward with a sneer. "He's nothing. He doesn't deserve this," he shouted, his words sharp but hollow. Yet even as he spat venom, the wall did not falter. The strangers did not reply with anger, nor with fists. They answered with silence, with presence, with a determination that spoke louder than any insult. The more he tried to provoke them, the smaller he seemed in contrast to their quiet strength. A teenager, barely more than a boy, stood at the front of the wall, his fists clenched at his sides. His father, standing just behind him, placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. "You don't have to fight," the man whispered. "Sometimes courage means standing still." The boy nodded, his chest swelling with a pride he had never felt before. He was learning, in real time, that strength does not always come from striking back, but from protecting those who cannot defend themselves. The veteran tried to speak, his voice breaking under the weight of emotion. Why would you do this for me?" he asked softly, his words barely audible. The older man who had given him the jacket bent down and answered, "Because you once stood for us. Now it's our turn." Simple words, but they landed with the force of a lifetime. The veteran lowered his head, unable to stop the sobs that came from deep within his chest. The attackers, realizing they had lost their grip on the situation, grew restless. One of them cursed under his breath, while another took a hesitant step back. The balance of power had shifted completely. What had begun as a moment of cruelty had transformed into a public declaration of compassion, and cruelty never thrives in the presence of courage. The crowd tightened its formation, not out of fear, but out of unity. It was no longer about shielding a single man. It had become about shielding a principle, that no one, regardless of their circumstances, should ever be left defenseless against hate. The human wall was no longer just a physical act of protection. It had become a living symbol of hope, a reminder that kindness can rise even when least expected. The attackers lingered, their frustration painted across their faces, but their confidence had shattered like glass. They had come expecting an easy target, someone weak and isolated, someone whose cries would be ignored. Instead, they found themselves staring at a wall of determination, a crowd that grew with every passing second. It was no longer just about a homeless veteran. It was about the people refusing to let cruelty define their streets. Among the strangers, a nurse still in her scrubs stepped forward, her eyes blazing. "This man once fought for strangers he never knew," she said firmly, "and now we will fight for him." Her words echoed like a vow, and the people around her nodded in agreement. It was a reminder that service and sacrifice should never end in abandonment. The veteran, hearing those words, felt a crack in the shell of despair that had surrounded him for years. The attackers exchanged uneasy glances, their unity unraveling. They had been fueled by arrogance, but arrogance cannot stand against conviction. One of them muttered something about leaving, his voice betraying a tremor of fear. Still, the leader tried to bark orders, but his words had lost their weight. The crowd wasn't listening to him anymore. They were listening to each other. The veteran wiped his face with trembling hands, looking at the strangers as though they were angels disguised as ordinary people. His chest heaved with emotion as he whispered, "I thought the world forgot me." The young woman at the front turned to him with tears in her own eyes and replied, "Not tonight. Not ever again." It was simple, but to him, it felt like a lifeline being thrown into waters where he had been drowning for too long. The human wall did not just protect him physically. It rebuilt his sense of worth, brick by brick, through every act of kindness, every word of encouragement, every silent body that stood between him and harm. This night was changing him, but it was also changing the strangers themselves. They were discovering their own power, realizing that standing together transformed them into something greater than fear. The crowd swelled until the attackers were completely surrounded by watchful eyes and unwavering bodies. The very air seemed to hum with tension, yet beneath it all was a profound stillness, the kind that comes not from silence, but from collective purpose. The attackers were no longer predators. They were intruders in a place where compassion had drawn the boundaries. One of the bikers who had stopped on the street dismounted his motorcycle and joined the wall, his leather jacket glistening under the streetlights. Without saying a word, he placed a hand on the veteran's shoulder, steadying him. The veteran looked up into eyes that carried the same weight he carried, the weight of battles fought, of scars hidden, of loneliness endured. In that silent exchange, a bond was formed, one that transcended words. The attackers began to retreat, their bravado evaporating. Some muttered curses as they walked backward into the night, but their voices were hollow, drowned out by the quiet power of unity. They realized too late that cruelty thrives only when good people stay silent. Tonight, silence had been broken, and their cruelty had been cornered by compassion. The crowd, however, did not disperse immediately. They lingered, ensuring the veteran felt safe, ensuring he understood that this was not a fleeting gesture. Children tugged on their parents' hands, whispering questions about why he lived on the streets, and parents whispered back with voices filled with both sadness and pride. It was not just a night of defense. It was a night of awakening, a chance to see the forgotten with new eyes. The veteran, overwhelmed, rose slowly to his feet. His legs shook, but the hands of strangers reached out to steady him. For the first time in years, he was not rising alone. The wall had held, the attackers had fled, but more importantly, something even greater had been restored. His place among people, his dignity, his worth. The veteran stood on unsteady legs, his eyes scanning the faces of those who had become his protectors. He saw strangers who had nothing in common, different ages, different backgrounds, different stories. Yet all of them had chosen to stand for him when it mattered most. His lips trembled as he tried to speak, but emotion choked his voice. For years he had been invisible, but now, every eye in that circle reminded him that he mattered. The young teenager, the same boy who had clenched his fists earlier, stepped closer and looked up at him. "Sir," he said softly, "my teacher told me heroes protect people. Tonight, I saw heroes." The veteran's eyes filled again, but this time with something brighter than grief. He placed his weathered hand on the boy's shoulder, whispering, "No, son. Tonight, you were the hero." The boy's face lit up, his innocence touched by the realization that courage can be found in standing still. The nurse from before gently asked the veteran his name, her tone filled with warmth. "Michael," he replied after a long pause, as though he had not spoken his name aloud in years. The crowd repeated it softly, some with tears, as though reclaiming his identity from the shadows of neglect. He was no longer the homeless man. He was Michael, a man with a story, a man with dignity, a man worth protecting. Someone from the crowd handed Michael a bottle of water. Another passed him food, while others simply stood close, their presence wrapping around him like a blanket. None of these gestures were grand, but to Michael, they felt like treasures beyond measure. Each act whispered the same truth. You are not alone anymore. The attackers had long vanished into the night, but the crowd's unity remained. This moment was not just about defense, it was about restoration. A broken man had been given back his name, his dignity, and his place among the living. And every person who stood there knew they would never walk away unchanged. The street, once cold and indifferent, had transformed into a place of community. Neighbors who had never spoken to one another found themselves sharing stories, united by what they had just witnessed. Parents hugged their children tighter, teaching them through example that kindness is strength. What had begun as an act of defense had turned into something larger, a reminder of the power ordinary people hold when they act with extraordinary compassion. Michael, still overwhelmed, tried to express his gratitude. His voice cracked as he said, "I thought my battles ended years ago. I thought I had been forgotten. But tonight, you gave me something I thought I'd lost forever, hope." His words pierced the hearts of those gathered, and many wiped tears from their eyes. Hope is fragile, but in that moment, it was alive again, burning brightly in the man who had once felt invisible. The biker who had stood silently with him finally spoke. "You carried the weight of protecting others when the world needed you most. Tonight, the world carried you. Remember that." His words resonated deeply, a powerful reminder that true strength is not one-sided. It is shared, passed back and forth when one grows weary. The crowd responded with gentle applause, not the kind that celebrated victory, but the kind that honored resilience. The sound rose softly into the night air, enveloping Michael like a song of belonging. For once, the applause was not for soldiers on a battlefield or leaders in power. It was for a man who had endured, for a community that had risen, and for the truth that even the forgotten deserve to be remembered. As the applause faded, Michael lifted his head higher, his shoulders straighter. He was still a man without a home, but no longer a man without a place. For the first time in years, he belonged, not to the streets, not to loneliness, but to the people who had stood for him when it mattered most. The night air seemed different now, warmer, calmer, as if the city itself had paused to witness what had unfolded. Michael sat again, this time not in defeat, but surrounded by a circle of protection that felt sacred. The strangers who had formed the human wall did not rush to leave. They stayed because they understood that this moment was bigger than a single act of kindness. It was about rewriting what community meant. A mother in the crowd stepped forward, her young daughter by her side. She knelt down so her child could look Michael in the eye. "Do you see him?" she whispered to her daughter. "He is not forgotten, and we must never forget people like him." The little girl nodded, then shyly handed Michael a small piece of candy from her pocket. It was a tiny gesture, but one that carried the weight of innocence and love. Michael's rough hand shook as he accepted it. He looked at the little girl, then at her mother, and finally at the growing circle of faces illuminated by streetlights. For years, his story had been silence. Now, his story was being rewritten through the compassion of strangers who refused to look away. The older man who had placed his jacket on Michael earlier spoke again, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "Sometimes we think kindness has no power in a world so cruel. But tonight, we proved otherwise. We showed that compassion can be stronger than hate." His words settled over the crowd, heavy with truth, and everyone felt the significance of what they had done together. What had begun as a potential act of violence had become a living testimony of humanity's resilience. The wall had dissolved, but the bond remained. These strangers had become something greater. They were now a community, bound not by names or addresses, but by the unshakable belief that every life deserves protection. As the crowd slowly thinned, a few remained by Michael's side. They didn't see their presence as an obligation, but as a choice. They sat with him on the curb, listening as he shared fragments of his past, his service, the brothers he had lost, the years he had spent searching for belonging. His voice was uneven, but for the first time, people truly listened. And that simple act of listening was a healing he had long needed. The nurse, who had spoken so boldly before, gently asked if he had anywhere safe to go that night. Michael hesitated, shame flickering across his face. Before he could answer, the biker stepped forward once more. "You won't spend a night alone," he said firmly. "Not after this." His words were not a promise born of pity, but of respect. It was the kind of respect Michael thought he would never feel again. One by one, people offered help, food, blankets, a ride, a warm place to stay. Michael, overwhelmed, pressed his hand to his chest as if trying to hold in the flood of gratitude that threatened to spill out. He had once believed kindness was something reserved for others, never for him. Tonight had shattered that belief, replacing it with something far stronger. The certainty that compassion still lived in the hearts of strangers. The streetlights flickered, casting golden halos over the faces of those who had stood together. They were no longer just individuals on their way home, but witnesses to something unforgettable. Each one knew they would carry this night with them, retelling it, remembering it, allowing it to reshape how they saw the world. And Michael, though still weary and worn, no longer carried the weight of being unseen. He had been shielded not by walls of brick or stone, but by human hearts. That night, his battle ended, not with defeat, but with the quiet, powerful victory of belonging. The city streets had witnessed countless stories of indifference, but that night became something different, something unforgettable. Word spread quickly, whispers turning into conversations, conversations into headlines. What began as a small group of strangers protecting one man became a story that carried across neighborhoods, sparking questions about what it truly means to stand for one another. Michael sat quietly, still absorbing the enormity of what had happened. For years he had felt invisible, reduced to nothing more than a shadow people passed without notice. Yet in one evening, strangers had chosen to see him, not as a homeless man, not as a burden, but as a life worth defending. The depth of that realization struck him harder than any battlefield memory. The teenager who had stood in the wall lingered, unable to leave. He finally looked up at Michael and said, "I'll never forget tonight. You taught me that even the smallest act of courage matters." Michael shook his head gently, replying, "No, son, it wasn't me. It was all of you." His voice carried the wisdom of someone who had seen both the worst and the best of humanity. Parents walked away holding their children's hands tighter, whispering promises to never let cruelty pass by unnoticed again. Some exchanged numbers, strangers becoming friends through the bond they had created. They understood that the wall they built was not just physical. It was a vow that compassion could still change the world. As the night stretched on, Michael closed his eyes for a moment, allowing himself to breathe without fear. For the first time in years, he felt something deeper than survival. He felt safe. And that safety came not from walls of stone or uniforms of power, but from people who chose to stand when it mattered. The attackers were long gone, but the memory of their cruelty lingered like a shadow. Yet it was overpowered by something greater, the light of courage and unity that had risen to defeat them. No one would remember the faces of those who tried to harm. They would remember the wall, the strangers, the way humanity stood taller than hate. That was the story that would live on. Michael, still weary but uplifted, looked around at those who remained by his side. His voice, soft but steady, broke the silence. "Tonight, you gave me back my faith in people. I thought kindness had died, but I was wrong. You proved me wrong." His words were not just for them, but for himself, a final confirmation that hope had not abandoned him after all. The biker placed a firm hand on Michael's shoulder, speaking with quiet conviction. "Hope doesn't die, brother. Sometimes it just waits, for nights like this, for people willing to carry it again." His words resonated deeply, reminding everyone that what they had done was not just a moment, but a seed planted in the heart of the city. The human wall had dissolved, but its spirit lingered. Each person who had stood there carried with them a renewed sense of responsibility. Not to look away, not to let cruelty win, and not to forget the man they had shielded. Their lives would return to normal, but their hearts would never be the same. As dawn approached, Michael's eyes caught the first light breaking across the horizon. For him, it wasn't just a sunrise. It was a beginning. He was still a veteran, still without a home, but no longer without a place. He had been defended, uplifted, and seen. And in that simple, extraordinary night, a forgotten man had been restored by the power of strangers who chose to stand together. That night proved something the world too often forgets, that the strength of humanity does not come from titles or wealth, but from ordinary people who choose to act when it matters most. A homeless veteran, once invisible and forgotten, was shielded not by walls of stone or armed authority, but by the living wall of compassion built by strangers. In a single act, they reminded us all that dignity is not a privilege, it is a right. The human wall was more than just protection. It was a message carved into the fabric of the night. Cruelty loses its power when courage multiplies. The attackers walked away in silence, but what remained was far louder, the sound of hearts beating together, defying hate with unity. Every person who stood there discovered a truth they would carry forever. When people rise for one another, no one stands alone. Michael, the veteran, left that street changed. He was still weary, still scarred by years of neglect, but he no longer carried the crushing weight of being unseen. He carried proof that hope lives in unexpected places, in the hands of strangers, in the courage of children, in the kindness of those who refuse to look away. His story became more than his own. It became a mirror for all of us to see what we are capable of. And as you reflect on this story, ask yourself, if faced with the same moment, would you walk by, or would you take your place in the wall? Because courage is not about grand gestures. It is about standing firm when someone else needs you most. That is the kind of strength that changes lives, the kind that echoes far beyond a single night. If this story moved you, let your voice be part of this wall too. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Give this video a like to show that compassion still matters. And subscribe to the channel so we can continue sharing stories that remind us of the power we hold when we stand together. After all, sometimes the smallest action, your voice, your presence, can be the very shield someone else has been waiting for.